When I'm writing any kind of story, I'm obviously thinking about characters, and the two questions it seems natural to start with are who are they and what are they like? But another maybe less obvious question to ask is why. But I think if you do ask yourself that, it helps you to create characters that feel like something more than just a character, something that is at least in some way approaching real. So if you're looking to write characters with depth and detail that feel like more than just writing on a page, me too. I'm going to talk about how I try to do that, so let's get started. Why, I think, is one of the most useful questions you can ask yourself when you're writing pretty much anything. It applies to so much when it comes to writing. It can lead you back to the point that you're trying to make if you've found yourself a little bit off track, and it can clear the dust from a message that you're trying to get across, and it can help you figure out how you came to be where you are. And certainly for me, it absolutely helps with developing characters too. Asking yourself as you're writing why your character is the way that they are and why they do the things that they do, I think gives you more control over them and it gives them more individuality. While a character might share personality traits with any number of characters from any number of other stories, the reasons why will always be different and unique if you stop to figure them out. Once you do that, a character's decisions and actions and the path they take through your story start to feel less like they're just plainly being steered by you, the author, and more like they're being informed by the history of the character. That makes them seem more like people and less like characters. Easy to say all of that, of course, but putting it into practice isn't quite as simple. And please don't think I'm suggesting that I've managed to achieve this with every character I've ever written. That's definitely not the case, and I'll prove it in a little bit. But every now and again, I might manage it. So now I'm focused on figuring out why that could be and what it is exactly that you have to do to make a character feel real. In my last video, I talked about how I try to create a story from a single moment. I'll link it up there and at the end of this video, but I think my approach to writing characters is pretty similar. I very rarely have any idea who my character is when I start stories, and even more rarely have I got a name for them or can I imagine what they might look like. Instead, I just start writing and I try to be informed by the history of the character, like I said before. Once I have my story concept or my moment pinned down, then I'll start thinking about what's happening, what am I in the middle of, and from that, I try to figure out how my character came to be there. And the answer to that always comes from a why. If we know that, then I think when the character steps onto the page, hopefully the reader might get the impression that they're stepping into a life that was already there, not just one that's been created for them to read. Giving a history to a character, even just in a detail or two, helps to set them into the story in a way that I think makes them feel far more real. I think to better make my point, I'll give you an example of when I've created a character that to me feels a bit more real, and then give you an example of when I really haven't. Hopefully that way we can understand how to create this effect. I use my own writing as examples for this kind of thing, not because I think it's brilliant and I'm the best writer ever, I don't. It's just that this way I can tell you with certainty what I was and wasn't trying to do and what went wrong. Here's an example of when I don't think I've created a real feeling character. It's from a recent story of mine, and to me the character just feels like a character and nothing more. This is the opening to a story that I wrote in November last year, and the idea of it was to create this kind of aloof and obsessive character who put all of the worthwhile things in life aside in pursuit of finding some money that was lost in the woods. You're never going to find that money. They're taking the house in a week's time, you know that. If you're not back in 2 days, I'm gone, I'm serious. The first thing to notice with this opening is that I really said a lot more about the character's partner, who's the one speaking, than I did about the character themselves. Reading it, you would assume that the speaker is the main character of the story and they're not, which is kind of confusing. I didn't bring my character to life because they're not even present. They're not talking, they're not in the scene, they're a shadow. Also, I'm sure you noticed I committed the sin of shoehorning in some exposition into that opening. Those lines really say far more about the plot of the story than they do about the main character. And if you did watch my video last week, you'll know that that's typically not how I like to approach stories, and it's probably the reason that I stopped working on this one, and that the character feels like a character, or just like a mannequin that I use to facilitate the plot of the story. This is just the opening though. What else did I say about the character when they eventually, showed up? It's a first person perspective, so Here's some of the things that I said from the character's point of view, and just see if you can spot anything in common with them. I set up camp. It took a while getting to sleep. I hadn't lit a campfire. I didn't move straight away. I could have gone for the gun. Did you spot it? They're all just action and plot-based things. This is supposed to be first-person perspective. There should be some internal monologue somewhere, but the only thing that's present in these lines is boring exposition and dull signposting. There's no sense of the history of the character. There's nothing there that makes us feel like the character's real. There's nothing there that gives us any chance to understand the character or get to know them. There's no why. Obviously, I said some other stuff during the course of that story, but nothing that brought the character to life any more than those lines did. The character just felt like they were on rails. My hand, as the writer, was just visible, moving them through the plot, like the worst, most boring puppet show you've ever seen. There was no life and absolutely no autonomy to the character whatsoever. And of course, no character in fiction ever has any autonomy, but just like you can almost swear that an object in the candlelight is moving slightly, as writers, it's our job to create the illusion that these characters are real people and to sustain that through our story. If we can do that, then I think we can get to that place where our readers forget that our characters aren't real people and they get invested in them. The character in that story was just an empty vessel to attach the plot to, and no matter how good the twists and turns of your story are, if you have a character like that, no one's ever going to remember them. So now that I've succeeded in assassinating my own story, that's the bad. But what about the good? The hopefully good. This example comes from a more recent story, something I just wrote this week. I'm just chipping away at this backwards novella in Flash thing that I'm writing. Video about that up there. I'm writing about a story a week at the moment, and this story came out very character driven. I'll go through some of the things I wrote that I think make my character feel a bit more real and talk about why I think they work. Here's the opening. It's a story all about loss and isolation. Cheerful stuff. She was far enough from the road for a fire, at least as far as her father used to be when he lit them. So that's only 2 sentences, but I already feel like this character has more life to them than the character from the last story. From this, we know that the character has some kind of reason to set a fire, which I suppose is the plot really more than the character, but we also know that her father used to set fires, and from that implication, it kind of suggests that the father isn't around anymore, and maybe it's a leap of logic, but it sort of feels like this character might be alone. Even if we are just guessing at that, it still gives a sense of history to the character. It still helps with that feeling that we're just happening upon this character at this point in her life, rather than that she just began existing as we started reading the story. There's someone there to get to know, rather than just a blank slate. What else did I say to try to make this character feel real? Here's another bit. Her sister had said anytime, call anytime, even if it was the middle of the night. Her brother had asked her if she thought maybe she needed something to do. That had kept her up nights thinking as the trees flexed their fingers on the ceiling above her. Now I've given the idea that something's definitely happened, and add that to the presumption that the father isn't around anymore, and hopefully how I'm trying to build a picture of the character and their life is starting to show through. I've given her siblings whom she clearly has different relationships with, and I've mentioned that how what they say keeps her up at night. She's a worried character who doesn't thrive being alone in a place she feels isn't her own. She could hear the animals in the early hours. The windows in her father's house had always been thinly paned and drafty. The story is from her perspective, but the house she's in is still her father's. This is me trying to make her feel out of place and isolated. In fact, she hates being alone so much that she's grown resentful of those who have left her behind. The cows circled every morning, as though they were looking for him. He was 3 months gone, but he'd forgotten to take all of the work with him. It was now up to her to worry about how rusty the barbed wire on the east side of the property was. It was up to her to call a vet and to wait for them at the edge of the field and to beckon them across the grass towards some animal or another. Her responsibility to count everything and speak to the bank and sign more things. Hopefully that passage, in the context of the story of course, helps to highlight some of the character's personality. I hadn't intended to make this character resentful at being bereaved when I started the story. I hadn't even intended to make her alone. The only thing I knew about the character going into the story was that she was standing next to a fire. I didn't just say she felt resentful because she'd been left a load of tasks to do and a load of responsibilities. I tried listing some of those individual tasks to help people empathise with feeling overwhelmed and out of your depth. I didn't say she felt her family were no help at all. I just told you some of the kind of ineffective things her family had said to her and let you naturally empathise with her. Hopefully. It's my word of the day. The point I'm trying to make, I think, is that I didn't focus on the what of this story. I didn't talk about what she looks like or where she is or even what she's really doing. Her name isn't even mentioned until the end of the story, for example. What I tried to focus on instead was the why of all of that. Personally, as a reader, I really don't care what metal a character's broken watch is made out of. I care far more that the character wears that broken watch because it used to belong to someone that they've lost. By all means, add the detail. Create that picture of your character for your readers from that imagination that you've got, but my advice would be to make sure you think about the why as well. I suppose it's the showing versus telling of characterization in a way. You need both of them at different times, but for me, to create a character that feels real and not just like fiction, they both have to work together. I know if I manage that, it makes me feel like my characters are more alive and more like people. And people are what stories are all about. Feel free to head to my website or join my free Discord server if you want to know a bit more about my writing or my flash fiction course. As always, thanks so much for watching and happy writing.